big zoom back and looking at the big picture from the Garden of Eden to the city of God. And today we are right in the middle of that. You know, I think one thing that we all know is here in the middle, we live with a certain amount of tension and a certain awareness, right, that things aren't always as they should be, right? You know, yesterday afternoon, I had plenty to do, a long enough to-do list, preparing for today. I'm going to be traveling this week, so I have to, do laundry and pack and, get everything ready. And I've been having some ear pain and during the week, and I wasn't able to get it checked out. And I ended up spending over 3 hours yesterday waiting to get my ear checked out because I'm like, if I'm going to travel, I need to know what's going on. I'm like, God, this is not how I was planning to spend this day today. This is not what I wanted to do today. This is not, what I was, planning on. And, this happens to us a lot, right, in big and little ways. It can be little things, like if you go to the wrong cafe, the barista gets your drink wrong, right? We know at least one cafe, well, that will not happen. But, it's a little irritation, but it can be disappointing. You're like, oh, I was looking forward to that so much, and it's messed up. But there's also big things that can happen, and they can be, like, life-shattering, and they feel like I have to completely reorient myself. Like, I don't know how can this happen? How can this go on? I don't understand. And we sometimes are just in such a place of, like, God, like, how can this be? When I was 8 years old, I got sick. Like, not like ear pain, go for a couple hours and get it checked out, sick, like really sick. And I spent weeks and sometimes months in the hospital. And this was not an easy thing for me or for my family. And I know, like, for me, I had to be away from my family. They didn't really know much about parents staying with kids at that time. It was like, okay, you're a kid, you're 8 already, you're a big kid, you just stay in the hospital. And, my mom and dad would come and visit when they could. I had 2 little brothers at home. And I know, like, for my parents, that was not an easy thing. And they asked a lot of questions. Like, God, how could you let this happen? This is my daughter. How can she be so sick? This is not how it's supposed to be. And so maybe you've experienced something bigger like that too. Maybe it's an illness that you yourself have challenged with, someone you love dearly. Maybe it's relational issues where things don't go right in a relationship and there's deep hurt. Maybe it's something that you did and you're like, I messed up so bad. And there's hurt and there's shame. And we know that we are living in this world and things are not as they should be. And so we live in this tension because, like Viv talked about last week, he talked about creation, he talked about the Garden of Eden, right? And how there's something in us that knows this isn't how it's supposed to be. And so how do we deal with this? Like, we feel broken. Yeah, we feel like something should be different, but we don't know what, and we don't know how to change it. And I'm just talking about the personal things, let alone the big world issues that we're confronted with. Like, how is this going to get worked out, right? And so how do we deal with this? And I was honestly hoping to find a few good, like, maybe some funny instances of, like, disappointment. What are things that people get disappointed about? And so I went on Instagram and looked at disappointment. What I found instead was advice on how to handle disappointment, because I guess Instagram is a great place to get advice. Right? But what Instagram was telling me was to avoid disappointment, expect nothing from nobody. Now I have to say, I have to question Instagram's grammar sometimes because I don't think that quite makes sense. But you get the point. Just don't expect anything and you won't be disappointed, right? Disappointed? That's what you get for expecting things. Disappointment comes easily to those who expect too much. And teach your heart to accept disappointments, even from people you love. And so the answer is just don't have any expectations and harden your heart. Teach yourself to expect disappointment. So that was the answer that I was hearing, right? And I'm like, I don't think this is the best way. So what do we do? What does the Bible have today? What answers does God give us for living in this tension of knowing this is not how things are supposed to be? We're going to turn today, like we said in the title, to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, you may be thinking, it's not just before Easter. Why are we talking about the Garden of Gethsemane? That's when we usually talk about it, right, in the lead up to Easter. But it was a crucial thing and so important in the big picture, in the story that God is writing with his creation. And so we're going to go to Matthew 26 today, and we're going to start in verse 36. It's a little bit longer, but I'm just going to read through. I'd like you to just read along with me and just try to even envision the whole scene, envision what's going on as we're reading it. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. Just going to interject. They had also just eaten a really big meal, and it was late at night. Okay, let's not be too hard on the disciples. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Gethsemane was a garden. It's also called the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a garden, like a park, full of olive trees. And it was actually right at the base of the Mount of Olives. That will, if you've read the Bible, if you've been in Christian circles, that will also sound familiar to you. Both of these places were places that Jesus and his followers frequented. It says that the Garden of Gethsemane was a place that Jesus and his followers, they went to often. Judas knew the place. He knew Jesus was going to be there because that was a place they went to. It's where they went often. And it's right basically at the base of the Mount of Olives, directly outside the city of Jerusalem. So they go out of Jerusalem. It says they go through the Kidron Valley, and then they're there at the base of the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. Directly outside of Jerusalem. The word Gethsemane means olive press. So there was probably olive presses there as well, if the olive trees were growing, and there were olive presses set up there as well. I imagine, when you have a place like that, a place that you've gone to many times, where people have prayed. This was a sacred place even before the time of Jesus. The first references we hear of the Mount of Olives, and probably people going through this area, was when David was fleeing from Absalom. So this place, this mount just east of the city, was a place where God's people had been, walking on, praying on, going to for generations, right? And for Jesus himself, it had been a place he came back to over and over again. I believe there's places like this, right, that can just feel holy, right? I know a place like this, just above Bingen. There's a hill, and there's vineyards along it. And at the top of this hill, there's a church, and there's also a group of nuns that live up there. And if you've ever heard of Hildegard from Bingen, that's where she was primarily residing, up there. It's called the Rokkosberg, above Bingen. And Eddie and I have, over the years, gone a number of spiritual retreats there. And you go and you walk in these vineyards, and one of the leaders there pointed out one time, he's like, people have been walking and praying in these vineyards for 1,000 years. This is the most blessed wine, the most blessed grapes in anywhere. Where else do you have vineyards that people have been praying over for 1,000 years? But you go there, and it's a combination of the history of the place and then the experiences that you have there yourself. I've gone there for spiritual retreats and encountered God because I took the time away. And, I truly believe when we set time aside to spend with Jesus, he will meet us wherever we are. If you're up, in this monastery on top of the vineyard, if you're in your living room, if you set the time aside, God will meet you there. And that place, it becomes holy because God has met you there. Yeah. So I feel that definitely there in that place. But I was thinking about this, and I can think of places over the years where I had an encounter with God, where he met me. And I can still think back. A lot of times, I'll take pictures of those places where I have a quiet time, and I'll sit there and I'll take a picture. So if you look at my camera roll, I sometimes have really random pictures of places that are probably meaningless to anyone else. Sometimes it's my dining room table with a cup of coffee. Sometimes it's a park I'm sitting in. When I went on a trip with the young adults during university, it was a beach where I left the group and just spent time alone on the beach, pouring my heart out to God. And I remember that now, all these years later. Or the time I took a boat out on a lake and sat there as the sun rose and just spent time with God. It can be you remember them and you think, God, I want that connection with you again. And sometimes, if it's not the lake that's on the other side of the world, but it's your living room, and you can go there, and I can connect with God. I can connect with God here. And so that's what the Garden of Gethsemane was for Jesus and his followers. And I also mentioned that it means oil press, right? And the way, the olive had a few different uses. But an olive directly off the tree is not like an apple where you can pick it and eat it, right? Olives, from what I understand, I've honestly never tried a raw, fresh off the tree olive, but they're hard and they're bitter, right? They need to be processed. That's why when you buy olives, they're always in a jar, right? Either having been processed with oil or in some kind of salt water or something. They've been processed somehow. And to make olive oil, they would, put the olives in this container and then use a huge stone to crush them, right? And they would crush the olives, and then they would put them into a basket, and then they would put the basket into a press press out the oil from the crushed olives. But an olive, just by itself, just fresh off the tree, doesn't give you oil. Like, you can't like squeeze it in your hand and get the oil out. You can't just eat it. It needs some kind of process, right? And I think, sometimes I think we can read too much into things, but sometimes I think God really does things deliberately. Because here's Jesus in the garden, that means olive press, pouring out his heart and being crushed for our transgressions. The other thing I notice about this scene, right, is that Jesus wasn't alone. He was there. He had all of the disciples with him. He called Peter, James, and John. Those were the closest three, the ones, like, on the special occasions, like, if no one else, like, he would ask them to be with him. He's like, stay with me, sit here with me, keep watch. Now, he knew exactly what was going to happen, right? And at the end, he's the one who wakes them and says, here comes my betrayer. So it wasn't that he needed them to keep watch for what was going to happen. But I think he wanted them near him. In John 13, when Jesus, before he washes his disciples' feet, and this is just at the start of that last meal, and this was just a few hours before these events, right? Just a few hours before he had, gotten and put on the towel and washed their feet. And it says that Jesus knew who he was, where he had come from, and where he was going. So he knew all of this, right? He knew, knowing who he was and where he had come from, he knew he had the power at his disposal to not go this way, to not be crushed, to not be completely shamed. We read it through 2,000 years, and I think the impact of the shame that it was, of what happened to Jesus, gets watered down a bit. There was no more shameful way to be treated and to die than the way that Jesus did. But in the garden, as Jesus poured out his heart, as he prayed, Father, not my will, but your will, he chose obedience to the Father. I love the way Beth Moore wrote it in her book called The Beloved Disciple. She says, there in the garden, the Son of God bore his private cross. Very soon he would bear it publicly when he rose from his knees, bruised with anguish, his face dusted with earth, was set like flint. Christ knew what he was going to have to do when he came to earth. He was as good as dead from the beginning. Jesus lived for one purpose alone, to do the will of his Father, and yet he still felt. I think this is also important to realize that, yes, Jesus would do the will of his Father, but he felt it. He was in anguish over it. It wasn't easy. So don't think when you're faced with a decision and you know what the right thing to do would be, but you're like, that's hard. That's hard. It's painful. It will cost me something I don't know if I'm willing to pay. You think, Jesus, you had it so easy. You had no choice. It's not true. Jesus had a choice, and he chose to be faithful. He knows what it is to be there in that place where you have to make that choice. And we know how the story continues, right? He says, here comes my betrayer, and there is Judas with soldiers and an angry mob. He's arrested, he's beaten, tortured, sent to trial, back and forth, and ultimately crucified. the most shameful way to die. The disciples are devastated, right? And we know that 3 days later, when they went to look for him, he wasn't there. He wasn't in the tomb anymore. And so the death that tried to shame him, tried to capture him, didn't have its hold on him. 3 days later, he came back to life. He was resurrected. And he did not die. He did not die again. You know, a few years ago, Eddie and I were having a very interesting conversation with a group of friends, one of which is a theologian. And he started talking about Jesus is the only person who was resurrected. We say, wait, what are you talking about? There's other people who were raised to life in the Bible. Yes, he said, but they, as far as we know, all died again. They were resuscitated. Jesus never died, right? And so I was thinking about, okay, so for example, Jesus' friend Lazarus, right? We read about in the Gospels, it tells us Jesus went, and Lazarus had been dead for several days. He was very dead, not just, little bit dead. He was very dead. And Jesus called to him, and he came out. But when he came out, he had the grave clothes wrapped around him. They recognized him right away. And as far as we know, there's no other indication. At some point, he died again and was buried, right? When Jesus rose from the dead, he was transformed. When Mary saw him for the first time, Mary was one of his closest friends. She was with him for years. She knew him. She did not recognize him right away. You can say it was because she was crying so much, which probably had to do with it as well, but he was transformed, and he did not die again. It's not like he lived a bunch more years, and then at some point when his life was over, he died. That's not what happened. How do we know? We know because we had the day off on Thursday, right? Right? This past Thursday was the celebration of Ascension Day. And it's really nice that we get the day off, especially when the weather turns just in time to make it like beautiful and we can get out. But it's a celebration, a remembrance of the fact that Jesus didn't die, that he ascended, right? That's what that day is for. That's why that day was put into the calendar, into the church calendar. And so let's read. And then why is it important that Jesus didn't die, right? So we're going to read what happened, right? In Acts chapter 1. A few of the Gospels reference it briefly, but we're going to go ahead and read in Acts chapter 1, starting in verse 3. After his suffering, he presented himself to them. So after Jesus' suffering, he presented himself to them, his followers, and gave them many convincing proofs that he was alive. And in the other Gospels, we know, like, he let Thomas touch his wounds. He ate with them. It wasn't just an apparition. He was really alive. He was there. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. On one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: "Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit." That's spoiler alert. We're going to celebrate that next week. Then they gathered around him and asked, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom of Israel?" Because you see, they still had a certain picture in mind. They understood a lot more at this point, but they still had a certain picture in mind of what it meant for Jesus to come back and for Jesus to reign. He said to them, "It is not for you to know the times or the dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive with power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes. A cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up at the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? The same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day walk from the city. So I find this pretty cool, right? They were on the Mount of Olives, just above on that same hill from the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus had poured out his heart in anguish and in prayer. And now he's on top of the hill, teaching them, speaking to them, and then ascending. And I like to picture this, like how they must have all been standing there. They're watching him. He's teaching, he's talking, and he's just like, goes up, and they're like left standing there, staring up at the sky, probably mouths hanging a little bit open, like, what is going on now? Right? He's gone again. But this time they understand more. And when you're at the top of the Mount of Olives is very similar in height to the Feldberg. You know, the Feldberg right outside of Frankfurt. So it's not a super high mountain, but it's high enough. When you go up to the Feldberg, you can get a great view of Frankfurt, right? And so it is with the Mount of Olives. You can go there. You have a great view of the city. And in fact, it was somewhere along the mountain as Jesus was entering Jerusalem on that Palm Sunday, where he stopped and he cried over the city. It was a place where you have a really good view of the city, and he stopped there. But that's where they were, again, in this place where they had been so many times. And as the disciples, as they left the Mount of Olives, where they were with Jesus, and went back into Jerusalem, they would have walked again past the Garden of Gethsemane, past the place where they had spent so much time with Jesus, and remembered how he had prayed that evening. So that left the disciples waiting, right? Waiting for what Jesus promised them. Where does it leave us? How does this help us to live in this tension that we all feel of things aren't as they should be? How does this help us to deal with disappointment, with heartache, with hurt, when things go so painfully wrong? So I think there's a few things that we can take with us and really apply to how we deal with situations, and to just how we view things, right? Because first of all, we can know that Jesus understands you. You know that, yeah? Because, like I said, he had to make a decision in that moment. He faced betrayal from someone close to him. The disciples, they had a picture in their mind of what they understood, how they interpreted, and how they understood that this was going to work when the Messiah came. And when it didn't happen the way they were expecting, they were disappointed, right? How did they deal with that? Judas chose to betray Jesus. Peter, we read when we continue reading, and after Judas shows up, Peter's ready to fight. He grabs a sword, he is ready to fight, and he does start, and Jesus stops him. But we know that Jesus, because, Peter, he doesn't betray him, but he denies him. They run away. And, if you've ever felt alone, if you've ever felt like someone you thought would be there for you wasn't, Jesus knows. He's experienced that. It says that he was tested in every way. So everything that we experience, he knows. We can go to it with him. He knows. And he's not a God sitting far off judging us. You should have done better. He's like, I know. I love you. I forgive you. In Hebrews 4, it says Therefore, since we have a great high priest, this is referring to Jesus, who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who was unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. If you're facing a situation of hurt, you can approach the throne of grace. If you know there's something that you did that you messed up, you can approach the throne of grace and receive mercy and forgiveness. Jesus died for our transgressions. Who says he was crushed for our transgressions. He also died for our hurts. We can bring that to him as well. He knows what it is to be hurt, and his blood covers that as well. So we have a God who understands us. He gives us an example to follow in this, and how he was dealing with this extreme pain. And he says, I am overwhelmed. He said that. He said, I'm overwhelmed. Have you ever felt overwhelmed? Jesus was overwhelmed to the point of death. But what did he do when he was so overwhelmed and grieving and allowing this just to impact him? Because, we can keep up a brave face, but sometimes when you allow the reality of something to really hit you, when you allow yourself to think about it, it can tear you apart. And what did Jesus do? He poured out his heart to God. He didn't hold up a facade and say, as if he was always going to do what the Father wanted. He pleaded with him. It's like, God, I really don't want to. This is hard. It's painful. Shame. It will cost me everything, my dignity, my life. He was honest with God. He poured it all out. He kept his friends nearby. They couldn't fully understand. They were there for him in the way that they could be, but he kept them nearby. And I really believe this is part of the reason he said to them to come, because he didn't want to be alone. He was human just as much as he was God, right? And he wanted them near him. And I think sometimes in our hurt, it can be tempting to push people away. But let's, one or two, maybe three trusted people who have proven themselves, who have been there for you time after time, let them be with you in your hurt. Let them sit there with you. And sometimes, if you're that friend, sometimes all you need to do is just be there. You don't need wise words. You don't need to do things. Just be there. Just be there with your friend. But he kept his friends nearby. And in the end, he was obedient to God. So I think it's good, it's normal when we wrestle with things. But let's be striving to be obedient to that which God is calling us to. We're going to wrap up soon. I'm going to ask Abby to come up and play as we get towards the end here. But, the last thing is how this applies, how we can take what we can take away from this story, from this thing, is that we have hope, right? Because Jesus struggled in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he remained obedient to God. A lot of people will draw a parallel between the Garden of Eden and how Adam and Eve were faced with a temptation. Did God really say? Maybe God didn't mean that. Maybe God doesn't have your best interests in mind. Maybe you should eat that fruit. And they listened to those voices, and they ate the fruit that God told them not to. Basically, they were saying, God, we know better than you do. We're going to go ahead and eat this fruit. And in the Garden of Eden, that perfection that God had created was disrupted. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was tempted. He was put a choice before him. He had to struggle. Does it really have to be like this, God? Does it maybe there's another way. Is there any other way? Yet not what I will, but what you will. And because Jesus chose obedience to the Father, things have started to be restored. And we can have hope. You know, and this is what these disciples were asking. Like when he was there with them and he's teaching them, is now the time? Are you going to fully restore things to how they're supposed to be? Jesus said, it's not ours to know the time. But we know that there is a time. We know that God is working in his creation, and he will do it. He will restore and redeem creation to how it was meant to be. And therefore, we have hope. We know that whatever we're dealing with is not the end. It's not the end. The end is victory. The end is restoration. The end is redemption. Romans 8 is just jam-packed theological kind of center point of theology, and just all of it is so good. But I wanted to read these verses. I'm going to read from the Message version because sometimes Paul, you have to read it a few times to understand and get what he's saying. And I find this a little bit easier to comprehend, and I love the way Eugene Peterson expresses it. He says, this resurrection life you received from God is not a timid, grave-tending life. It's adventurously expectant, greeting God with a childlike, what's next, Papa? God's Spirit touches our spirits and confirms who we really are. We know who he is. We know who we are, Father and children. We know we are going to get what's coming to us, an unbelievable inheritance. We go through exactly what Christ goes through. If we go through the hard times with him, then we're certainly going to go through the good times with him. And that is our hope. We don't have to just have no expectations. We don't have to harden our heart. In fact, quite the opposite. We can expect everything from God because he cannot disappoint us. We don't have to harden our heart. In fact, in his presence, we can soften it and allow him to soften it and to work in us. You see, there's another place where it says, where what you did, you meant for evil. Joseph talking to his brothers. You meant it for evil, but God used it for good. And even in things, and I know there are things that are just so hard and so incomprehensible. We think there can be no good in it. As long as we are on this earth and God's mercy reigns, there is at least a sliver of good. What good came out of me being sick as a child? I was not miraculously healed, but I learned compassion. I learned patience. And I am healthy now. God can redeem. And I want to make this clear. This is just coming to me right now. But this is important to me because sometimes Christians can use these verses to kind of mean everything that happens. Like, it's tricky. I don't want to get too theological. I want to say, not everything is how God intended it. We live in a broken world. But God can use these circumstances. He can redeem even the darkest of things. And he can make you whole again.